Well, hey everybody, I'm Pete. So glad to be with you guys this morning, wherever you are. I don't know about you, but I know for me, I'm really excited about the fact that spring is in bloom. I've been looking forward to spring for a really long time. I guess everybody does in the sense that winter just seems to take forever every year. But now things are happening outside that are just beautiful. For instance, all the trees are growing their leaves, which I'm really excited about. Flowers are in bloom. My wife, Marie, she got this tray of vegetables that she was preparing to plant outside as spring came, and they're all growing their little buds on them and starting to grow, which is awesome. There's smells outside that are just beautiful as you start to smell all the smells of spring and everything like that. It's light jacket weather. I mean, everything about it is just awesome to be outside. And I like to spend as much time outside as possible, particularly on my back porch. And when I'm on my back porch, I have a tendency to stand in awe or sit in awe of all the trees that are back there, because many of them have been there for a very, very long time, 50 plus years. In fact, there is this massive tree in my backyard. I wanted to show you a picture of it this morning. Take a look at this picture. This tree is in my backyard. And when I'm outside, I'm just staring at this tree, looking at how beautiful it is, how big it is. Especially if you just consider this first little point right here is 16 feet high. I mean, just to give you a little frame of reference of how high this tree is, I have a picture of my daughter hugging this tree. Take a look at this. There's my daughter hugging that. It's just kind of showing you how massive this thing is. Also, I thought it was cute that she's been wearing these pajamas for the last 7 weeks, and so they really smell bad. But just go back to the other tree. It's a beautiful tree. It's very large. The thing about this tree is trees don't start this way. Clearly, they start in a different way. In fact, I brought this morning a tree that was growing in my backyard. Now, this was growing right underneath another tree that I have in my backyard. And I want you guys to see it real close. So if the camera just wants to get a zoomed up picture of this, you can see how big or how little this little sapling is. This thing was growing on another tree, and I compared the leaves to the leaves of that tree just to make sure it was the exact same thing, and it is. What's crazy about this little tree is I could take my 2 fingers and I literally could snap this tree in half because it's so small and so insignificant yet in its life. In comparison to this tree over here on this picture, this tree is so massive that if it fell down, it literally would crush my house and destroy my house. Now, it's crazy because trees don't start that way. They start small instead of being as big as they are. But if conditions are ideal, a tree like this over time can grow to be as massive as that other tree is. And over the course of 50 years, it can be so big and so strong. In fact, there was just a storm that came by last week. I'm sure you guys remember it, but that storm was blowing a lot of wind in my backyard and knocked down 2 pear trees in my backyard. But this other tree, that tree that I showed you in the picture, it didn't even drop a branch. It's kind of crazy how it stood strong through the test of even a giant storm. A few years ago, actually, I lived in a town called Pottsville. Some of you guys might actually live there now. But in Pottsville, it was the first house that my wife and I, Marie, bought. And when we bought this house in Pottsville, I'm telling you, my backyard was probably the size of a napkin. It was so small. But I decided I was going to have as green a thumb as I possibly could because I was really proud of my patch of grass. And so I bought a tree to put in the backyard. And when I planted it back there, it was not exactly ideal conditions. In fact, the soil wasn't really great. I mean, in Pottsville, it was sucking on a lump of coal, literally, for its nutrients. And then there was this giant pine tree in my backyard, so it just covered my yard with total shade. It didn't get anything that it needed, and so in a few months, it was just an apple stick. It was really nothing. But good conditions, they facilitate growth. And bad conditions like that situation, they can stifle our growth. But it's not just true for trees. It's also true for all living things, even you and me. In fact, it's amazing how good conditions in our lives can produce growth and maturity, and we can grow strong and have deep roots like this tree does. In fact, maybe you have seen some of those conditions in your life that produce growth for you, where you can find yourself having grown because of several things that have happened in your life that have developed your maturity in your life. In other words, maybe you've had some friends in your life who are strong believers, who have been believers in Jesus for a really long time, and they've influenced you in such a way that has inspired you to grow in your relationship with God. Or maybe you have been consistent and you've taken some time every day for a really long time in prayer. Maybe you're reading your Bible and you're just growing from the things that you're reading or from the time that you're spending with God on a regular basis. Or maybe you served. Like maybe you decided at some point in time, you know what, I'm going to jump on a team somewhere. Maybe you volunteered in the nursery and changed diapers for a while. Or you decided I'm going to help out with a small group of kids. And as you invested in their lives and they didn't want to listen to you, eventually some of them took their steps in their relationship with Jesus, and watching their little hearts grow impacted your life. And so maybe serving has changed you and has grown you. Or maybe you've heard some practical teaching from the Bible that has just inspired you to make some decisions to follow Jesus. Whatever it might be, all of those things are the good conditions in our life that can really inspire us and can grow our relationship with Jesus, and it can cause our faith to grow deeply rooted. Maybe you've experienced that. Or maybe you have also experienced or seen someone at least go through some major storms in your life, where storms have hit and it seems like tsunamis are washing past you. Maybe right now, you're feeling like you're in the midst of a great storm in your life that is hard. But we can see sometimes when great storms come upon mature people in their faith, that are deeply rooted in their faith, their branches might blow around a lot, and they might sway back and forth, but you find that they come out on the other side stronger. In fact, if you were here, or if you joined us on Easter, we did this video at the beginning of our Easter service where there was a few stories from some people in our church, and one of them was a guy by the name of Rick Herbert. Gosh, this guy inspires me because if you would have heard his story, he has some challenging things that happen in his life, but in the last few years, he's really been strong in his faith, really mature. But just a few years ago, he ran into a situation, which I would consider a major storm, where he had cancer in his throat. And when he faced that cancer, I'm telling you, like the things that he talked about, I'm sure that if they hit my life, they would sway me a lot harder than they swayed Rick, because it sounded like he couldn't eat for a very, very long time except eating through a straw. And it was really hard for him to walk up a set of stairs. And it was so difficult for him to do so many things. But when you hear him talk about Jesus, man, it's inspiring, because his words literally are, Jesus didn't just show up in his life, he showed off. And it's amazing to think that Rick, like facing this incredible storm, talks about his Jesus, and you see him on the other side of this cancer now, stronger and stronger through the whole thing. Because maturity matters. Maturity really matters, and spiritual maturity, and I would say probably matters more than anything in your life, because it dictates all the other maturities in our life. I mean, spiritual maturity can help us navigate through all the hard times. It can lead us to fewer regrets. It can lead us to greater hope in our life. And so spiritual maturity is incredibly important. In fact, over the last few weeks, we started a series called All Things New. And as we've been talking about these things, we've been talking about a guy by the name of Paul who wrote a letter to a church in Ephesus, just describing some of the things, a process that can help us take steps in our spiritual maturity. In fact, he kind of described that there's an old way of life that we live outside of a relationship with Jesus that we're supposed to put off, and a new way of life that we're supposed to put on. And he's got some incredible insights into really the way that we're supposed to live and act and walk in our life with Jesus. And this week, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that as well, because as Jesus gets a hold of our hearts, and we let him get a hold of our hearts, we become something brand new. Because as Jesus interacts with us, and he teaches us who we're supposed to be, some crazy things can happen in us that we can become a new creation. And truly, as believers in Jesus, as followers of Jesus, we should look different. We should look made new, because we should be made new into the image of Jesus, as we put off and we put on. So in chapter 4, verses 26, Paul continues to talk to us a little bit about some emotional maturity, and I thought we could really benefit from what he has to say. So check this out. He says, "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold in your life." You know, what Paul is literally telling us to do here is not to allow ourselves to create regret in our life, regret that comes when we allow ourselves to get into a place of sin in the midst of anger. And he literally tells us that there's not really that much time for us to let it go. Because oftentimes when we let our anger go, it turns into a place of a festering problem in our life. When we let the sun go down, when we let the days pass, problems happen in our relationships with other people and our relationship with God. And so he gives us this great encouragement to put off this old way and to put on something brand new. I think all of us can relate with anger. And in fact, if you're sitting here today and you're like, dude, I never get angry, maybe you should call someone into the room and ask them that question. Have I ever been angry? Because the truth is that all of us have struggled with anger in some way, shape, or form. And it's my guess that probably all of us have developed some regrets that have to do with some times that we've been angry. Because often when we're angry, we actually, like, our temper gets hot and we end up hurting the people that we love. And in our impatience, we say things that we often wish that we could take back, which is a terrible thing to think. But we can hold grudges in anger, and we can distance ourselves from the people that we love that mean so much to us. And Paul's advice is not to let that be an excuse that we do those things, but to put off the old self. And when we train in God's presence, we can grow spiritually mature. And his advice may be hard, but it will help us be more mature in the attitude of Jesus. And with that in mind, I thought if I'm going to emulate myself after Jesus, I want to know his perspective on this. I want to understand a little bit more how Jesus feels about anger and what he gives me advice to do in the midst of when I'm feeling angry, because I think there's such clear advice of what he asks us to do in the midst of our struggle, in the midst of when we're angry. So let's check this out in Matthew chapter 5. Here's what he says. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, rakah, is answerable to the court. Now, that word rakah literally means empty-headed or foolhardy. And then he continues by saying this. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in the danger of the fire of hell. You know, I think sometimes we all can relate with the fact that murder is wrong. And so when we would say, you know, when he says do not murder, we're like, yeah, of course, we understand that. And everybody listening when Jesus said that was like, yeah, murder is definitely wrong. But Jesus elevates this whole concept that anger is something that is much more wrong than we might even assess. That allowing ourselves to be mad at our brother or sister or to be stuck into a place where we are just letting our anger fester is something that's really, really not good. And it does more harm than we can actually imagine in our life. In fact, Jesus continues to tell us what we should do with that, and I want you to see it here. He says this, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. He's like, dude, if you're coming to the altar and you're coming to a place where you're going to worship me, but you have a problem with your brother or sister, listen, you can't move forward with your relationship with Jesus unless you go and you handle that relationship with your brother or sister first. If you've got a problem there, then you have a problem with me. You need to drop your offering right here and go work that out immediately. I mean, Jesus is passionate about helping us to understand that this is really, really important. That when we're angry, we shouldn't allow it to continue, to not let the sun go down on our anger, but go deal with it right away. He continues in a passage where he's having a conversation with one of his disciples by the name of Peter, and Peter is just asking him a question about how he should relate in a situation like this with forgiveness. It's found in Matthew chapter 18, and here's what Peter says to him. He says, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Now, I think this sounds like a lot when you consider about the fact that here in American culture, we might have said to someone or thought to ourselves before that I'm going to give you like 3 strikes. In other words, if someone messes with me one time, I'll forgive them and I'll let it go. The second time, I'll let them go, but I'm not going to forget. And the third time, if someone messes to me, 3 strikes and you're out. And we're used to that concept that when someone messes with us 3 times, we can't forgive after that. Like, we learn our lesson and we move on. And I think Peter, when he's asking Jesus, like, up to 7 times, he's literally going double of that. He's trying to stretch it out and say, hey, man, if I just go twice as much as I think that I possibly should forgive, is that the right thing to do? And in my perspective, I look at that and I go, that should be plenty of times, enough for Peter to be able to say, I've done all that I can do. But Jesus being God has a completely different perspective, and he answers this question in a couple of ways. Here's the first way he answers it. He first says to him, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, even 77 times sounds like an extreme amount of times to forgive someone for something that they've done. Listen, I'm mad at them for their offense. 7 times sounds a lot. 77, what are you talking about? This is so many times. But if we read this in other versions, King James Version for one says not just 77 times, but 70 times 7 times. I mean, that number equals 490. But what Jesus is not saying is not 490 times. He's just saying, listen, Peter, forgive. You might think that forgiving once is enough. You might think that 490 times is enough, but the reality is it's not. The heart behind this is that when someone sins against you, forgive. Walk with an attitude of forgiveness for this person. And then he continues to display to Peter and obviously to all the readers for the next couple thousand years. For us to understand exactly what he meant by this, he gives us this parable, this story. And I love it when Jesus tells a story so that we can understand exactly what he meant. He really wants us to know. Here's what he said. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought before him. Now, just for a second, I thought it was important to talk about how much 10,000 bags of gold is. So there's a master, and Jesus is talking about this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. Here's a perspective for you to understand, Peter. There's a man who owes his master 10,000 bags of gold. Now, I just did a little digging in today's market because, during the coronavirus, the price of gold has been going up. And I think today, maybe it's a little higher than it was yesterday, but it's like $1,700 per ounce of gold. And if you do the math in a 40-pound bag of gold, that's a lot. That's a high price that's inside of one 40-pound bag of gold. But you take that times 10,000, and the number that we're talking about here that was owed was, in today's day and age, $11 trillion. 11 trillion. We're talking about this is a massive amount. This is not something where if in a few minutes this guy could pay this off. Hey, give me some time and I'm going to work out this deal. This man owes so much money. There's literally no way that he's ever going to pay this off. So he owes him quite a bit of money. So here's what happens. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The master is looking at him and he's like, listen, you don't have enough to pay me. You will never have enough to pay me. So we're going to sell everything that you own, including your wife and children, all your possessions, and then you can serve me for the rest of the time. You'll never, ever be able to pay me back. This is an unrepayable debt. And of course, the servant is crushed. He wants to know how he can pay off his debt, and he looks at the master and he begs him. He says, at this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. He's begging, please, please, please. Please give me an opportunity to pay this back. And the master responds, the servant's master took pity on him, and he canceled the debt, and he let him go. This is an incredible thing, especially as Jesus is telling this story, because as it's a parable for us to understand the amount of forgiveness that we're supposed to give. We're saying that this man owed a massive amount, and just like me, I owed a massive amount to my Heavenly Father. I owed a massive amount to God, who's willing to sacrifice everything for me, and there's no way I could pay off my debt. There's nothing that I could do. That the Heavenly Father would cancel a debt like this is an incredible act of kindness, an incredible act of forgiveness. Now, this is interesting because this servant instantly goes back to another servant as the story continues. It says, but when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Now, just to kind of describe to you the weight of what is actually happening, this is a big deal because this man owed just a few silver coins. And in today's market, by the weight of how much those silver coins were, that man actually owed this to his servant. $1,567. In today's day and age, we literally could pay that off in just a few months with no interest payments. We could pay that off. That's not a lot. And so this man goes to his servant after being forgiven an incredible amount of debt. He goes to his servant and has this conversation with him. It's ironic that he does this. Here's what he says. The fellow servant fell into his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. This man did the opposite of what had just happened. While the master had given him an incredible amount of forgiveness, he let him off of a debt that he could never, ever, ever pay. He turns around to his fellow servant and throws him in jail and takes away his freedom, knowing he'll never be able to pay off $1,500 in jail. He didn't forgive like his master had forgiven him. And Jesus' response is important here, at least as he tells the story of the master. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged, and they went and they told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all of that debt because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" I mean, he looks at him in the face and he's like, "I gave you all of that grace, and then you turned around and you treated him in a way that you didn't want to be treated. You didn't forgive after I forgave you." And he continues and says this: "In his anger, the master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. And he said, 'This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart.'" In other words, in the kingdom of heaven, what Jesus requires, the way that we should be forgiving, the way that we should respond to people who owe us, the way that we should respond to people in anger, is to forgive them from the bottom of our heart, to give them the same kind of grace, because every offense, in this comparison that Jesus is making, every offense, everything that could be owed to us is a minor offense compared to the surpassing greatness and forgiveness that our Heavenly Father has given us. He's given us an incredible amount, and he asks us to forgive, and he asks us to love in the light of that. And then in Luke chapter 23, we see this other story, which I just find so incredible, because he's hanging on a cross in this story. And hanging next to him is two criminals, and both of them are there because of the things that they've chosen to do, right? But Jesus isn't hanging on the cross because of the things that he has done wrong. He's hanging there because of the things that I have done wrong. And as he explains so eloquently in that story, he's now living out this demonstration of a love that he's giving to all of mankind. He's there because of the fact that I deserve to be there, that we deserve to be there. He's there paying for my sin on the cross. But in that same scenario, he has a conversation with these two guys who are there with him on the cross. And here's what they say. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we're getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." And this is just an incredible scenario what happens here, but here's what he says to Jesus. "Then Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." I mean, and he's sending a Hail Mary in a sense. He's literally looking at Jesus and he's like, "Listen, I know I'm dying. I know I've done nothing to deserve this. I know there's no reason why you being God, hanging on a cross next to me, should ever forgive me for what I've done. But Jesus, if I put my faith in you, will you forgive me?" And Jesus looks at him and he responds like this. He answered him, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise," without deserving any forgiveness. Jesus looks at this man who is undeserving, and he forgave first in the midst of his own execution. And in a very similar way, earlier in the passage, before Jesus had this conversation with these guys, he had a similar conversation with the executioners who hung him on the cross, and it looked like this. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." I mean, again, exemplifying just this incredible thing. He's not hanging there because of anything he's done. He's hanging there because of what I've done. And he looks out amongst the crowd, amongst the executioners who put him there on the cross. And in this moment, while he's bleeding and dying, he looks out and says, "Forgive them." And I have to think to myself that not only is he speaking to the crowd that's there, but he's speaking to us through time, forgiving us for what we have done to put him there on the cross. That Jesus' example at every turn in his stories and in his example, he's forgiveness first. That in his anger, in a place where he could have been so mad, in a place where he could have proved who he was and demonstrated to all of us what we deserve, he gave so freely his love to all of us, his forgiveness to us. And there's no doubt, there is no doubt for all of us, anger is a hard thing to wrangle in. And we've all got things, we all have people in our life who push our buttons. But I think there's so much wisdom in what Paul says when he encourages us not to sin in our anger. Because if anger is unchecked, if we let it fester in all of our lives, it can become something that can spiral out of control. It can become a part of our lives that we really don't like. And the thing is, when we get mad at someone, we tend to make assumptions. If we spend a night or two, it can turn into a week or two, which can sometimes turn into a month, Maybe that turns into a year of time that we haven't talked to someone because of the thing that they've done to us, and we tend to sin. We might fall into misjudging other people's motives. We might gossip about them behind their backs. We might hurt them. We might make their offenses often bigger than they actually are. And I gotta say this, as I was putting this message together and as I've been thinking about these thoughts, I find myself in the midst of these pages. That I've struggled a lot in my life with forgiveness. I've struggled a lot with when I'm mad at someone, how do I make them pay? And assuming their motives and just judging them without having conversations. And I know the difficulty that it is to actually let those things go. But Paul says that part of training and part of becoming godly, part of being made new into the attitude of Jesus is that we put off the parts, these old parts of ourselves that are weighing us down, that are hurting us. They're breaking our relationships, to put that off and to be made new with our new self. And in order to do that, we can't allow ourselves to sin in our anger. Because when we let that sun go down in our anger, when we let the days pass, and we leave it unchecked and festering, we give the devil a place to have influence in our lives. And I think our best model of that is to follow Jesus' teaching. Our best model is to walk in the ways that he lived. And that's why I believe that this is true. That emotional maturity begins when I model Jesus' attitude of forgiveness. Let me just read it again. Emotional maturity begins when I begin to model Jesus' attitude of forgiveness. And so I wanted to talk for the next couple minutes just about 3 things that I can do to help begin to frame that with all of our lives. Just 3 simple ideas that I think we can follow. And the first one is this, that I think we need to start with forgiveness in mind. If we're going to model our lives after Jesus, if we're not going to give anger that foothold in our life that destroys our relationships, if we're going to listen to what Paul has to say about putting off our old self, then it starts with forgiveness in mind, starting with forgiveness in mind. That instead of going down a road of who can I blame, I'm thinking about how can I forgive people for offenses, whether or not they deserve it. I find myself in this example so much because even as a young teenager, when I would get home from school or from work or wherever I was, and I would drop my keys in my wallet, the place where I knew I was putting it, and then I'd go and I'd do whatever else I'm doing, and I come back an hour or 2 hours later, and my keys in my wallet are not where I thought that they were. You know what my tendency was? And maybe you can relate with this. I would always blame my mom for it. I would just call out her name, and then I would just assume that she had moved it or she'd done something with it. And you know what? That's translated into my adult life, that I've done the same thing to my wife. I've done that same thing to my kids. I've done that same thing to my coworkers, where I assume blame before I actually think, what if I forgive them for what I think they did? And then assume that maybe it was me and not them. And I think if I would start with forgiveness in those situations, I could find myself having better resolution to those conflicts, and maybe not even starting conflicts to begin with, because Jesus' example was to forgive $11 trillion of debt without someone having to pay it off. And his example was, how many times do I forgive? 70 times 7, like that 490 concept where it's like, I got to forgive continually and let it go. The thief on the cross, the executioners, everything Jesus was doing was in a mindset of forgiveness was the front thing. Before there was ever blame to be dealt with, before there was ever any resolution, he walked down the road of forgiveness with all of those areas in his life. And following Jesus' example should really start with that forgiveness in mind. The second thing that I think we can do is this, is believe the best. I think it comes really, really natural for us to assume the worst about people. We tend to walk down that road of assuming the worst in other people's lives as opposed to believing the best. In fact, just the other day, I heard my 2 kids fighting about this, and this is just a simple childlike example, but I think it does relate because I know it relates in my heart. But just the other day, my son and my daughter were fighting in their room, and my daughter was saying, "I'm sorry." And my son was saying, "No, you're not." And so I called my son out to the room that I was sitting in, and I'm practicing to be the best parent that I can be. And so instead of just telling my son that he was wrong, I wanted to walk him down this conversation. And I asked him this question, "Hey, Pete, have you ever actually met someone that can read people's minds?" And his answer was obviously, "No, Dad, I haven't." And I said, "How about this? Have you ever been on YouTube or seen any like TV shows or something like that proves that people can actually read minds?" He said, "No, I haven't." "Well, let me ask you this, Pete. Do you believe that it's possible to read someone's mind?" "Dad, no, I don't believe it's possible to read someone's mind." "Okay, all right. With all that in mind, Pete, how do you know what Mia, your sister, was thinking? It's so funny because it switched really fast, and he said, I just know. I was like, so you think you can know what Mia was thinking? Yes, I can know what Mia was thinking. So I asked him, what am I thinking right now? He's like, I don't know. I'm like, that's because you don't know what people are thinking, right? But we do this, right? We assume that we know what other people are thinking. And I asked him, what if we started in this relationship by believing that when Mia said she's sorry, that she meant it? And instead of saying, you have to accomplish something first, Mia, because I know what you're thinking, I'm assuming I know your brain. I know the inside of your brain. Trusting her, believing the best, that when she says she's sorry, she's sorry. What if we started that way in our relationships? That we believe the best before we assume the worst. And Jesus really demonstrates, forgiveness is our job. We can't assume that we know the motivations of everybody else's hearts. We can't determine what they were thinking when they did what they were doing. All we can do is trust that if we believe the best and we walk down the road of forgiveness, that God's going to meet us there by doing what he asks us to do. And the third thing is just to make no excuses. Because when I think about this, I think Jesus didn't make excuses for me. I mean, while hanging on a cross, he didn't first request that people understand what they're doing so that he can forgive them. He just forgave us. He never encouraged us first to blame and then forgive. He doesn't give us a way out when he explains the 70 times 7 and the practices that we're supposed to do. He doesn't give us room to make excuses. Paul didn't give us room to make excuses in this either. He didn't say, quick, prove you're right before the sun goes down. He said, work out your anger before the sun goes down, because there's no time. We don't have time to let these things go, because the longer we'll let them fester, the longer they can control us, and we really do. We give Satan a foothold in our life, so don't make excuses. Just the other day, I heard the story of this woman who I think illustrates this so incredibly. Her name was Samara. Here's a picture of her. This lady, Samara, she's by this memorial because her son was stolen from her early in life, too young. He was 18 years old when he was murdered. And he was murdered. They knew who he was murdered by. It was his best friend named Bilal. They got into a street fight, and he ended up murdering his friend. And so this mother was just so torn up about the fact, clearly, obviously, because her son was murdered. But it's interesting. She's an Iranian woman, and in Iranian culture, the husband was actually given the freedom to decide what the punishment should be for for the other child, for the murderer. But he decided, because of how torn up the mother was, that she would have the ability. He relinquished that right, and he gave the ability to her to decide what's going to happen to this boy, Bilal. What's going to happen? And so she was so upside down in her head that she said that, she was actually quoted in the Associated Press. She said that retribution had been the only thought that was on her mind. And so she decided that he was going to go to the gallows, that he would be hung, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of a thing, that his life was going to be taken because her son's was taken. And then they had this interesting thing that happened, while he's on the gallows. They're having this conversation back and forth. He's blindfolded, and he's screaming to her saying, don't do this because of my parents. They don't want to experience this. And she's shouting back to him, well, what about my son's parents, me? What have you done to our life? I mean, she was at a place where she's like, I can end your life, and I can find retribution. I can take revenge right now. But then this crazy thing happened that sends ripple effects through Iranian culture happens, because she decides to do something completely different, countercultural to what was happening in her heart. And she walks up to him on the gallows, and here's this picture. She slaps him in the face, and she grabs a hold of the noose and pulls it off of his head, giving back his life and forgiving him. I mean, in spite of all of the struggle, the inner turmoil that was inside of her, she decides to forgive. She decides to give back his life. Even though the blame wasn't undone, even though the act still happened, she walked down the road of forgiveness first. And so many people, as they were listening, and so many communities around Iran were impacted as she decided to do this incredible act. And I find myself realizing, in the storms of life, in the moments when I'm finding myself so angry, and those storms are coming. Because we've got storms right now that are happening all around us, and we've got interactions in our family that are happening because we're so close together. When we find ourselves in those situations, I don't think we need to walk down the road of destruction in our relationships. As we decide to put off that old self and put on that new self, we can look more like Jesus as we model his attitude in our lives. And if we can just throw up this bottom line one more time, I really truly believe this, that emotional maturity begins when I model the attitude of forgiveness, Jesus' attitude of forgiveness. So much changes in my life as people begin to see Jesus in me, and I model this attitude. And it's the key to starting to put off that old self and put on that new self, to become more like Jesus in everything that I say and I do. Let me pray for you guys. Jesus, I thank you for the fact that you love me and you love the people of this church, the people of our communities. You love the surrounding people around that. God, there's not a person that's ever walked on the face of the earth that you didn't give your life for. I thank you, God, for that. And I thank you that as I'm standing here, I know that. And I want the world to know who you are and how much you sacrifice. And I pray that people will begin to see you in us. As we put off the old self and we put on the new and maturity happens in our life, that more and more people can know about who this God is, the God-man who came to this planet and sacrificed everything for us. Jesus, thank you for what you've done. Help me to be more like you with everything that I say and do. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We'll see you here again next week.